Hi everyone, hope you're all doing well. Hirsch Sai here, reporting from Auckland, and today is the 17th of April 2024. Yeah, it's interesting. We've all heard about just how important the management of things are. Whether it's say your own personal management of money. Recall that talk video I made. In fact, being the very first talk video I made. 5 easy ways to save money, and just it's amazing how much of a difference they can make, especially if you apply them to say virtually all the areas of your life. It's just again, just when you eliminate inefficiencies and unnecessary wastages and things you simply don't need, it's amazing, how much more affordable life really is. Management of things is very important. So whether you're an individual, whether say you're the head of a company, whether you're, you could even say the prime minister or the president of a country, or whether you're running an empire. No matter what it is, just management of something is very important. And as we've seen in the past, many examples, sometimes it's not really how much someone started off with, whether it was a little or a lot. It was just what they did with it and how well they managed things, And of course, you've heard of people who earn a lot of money, have very high paying jobs, yet they don't seem to have much in the way of assets. And sometimes not only do they spend virtually all their money just on things they don't really need or things that go down in value. But they can even get into debt as well, unnecessary debt. Or, when you have debts on things like household goods and cars, things that go down in value, yet you're still paying the same amount of interest on those debts. It's sometimes referred to as dumb debt, as opposed to, say, debt, which is, say, on an investment property, something which is going to go up in value, which is giving you money. And again, the interest payments are going to stay more or less the same, of course, depending on what happens with interest rates and what deals you have with the mortgage provider over it, or the financial institution over it. So, and again, that's as we've heard, especially from books like such as Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, what he refers to as good debt and bad debt. Good debt is debt on assets that or things that go up in value, whereas bad debt is on debt on things that go down in value. So again, it's interesting, what happens there. And sometimes we've heard of celebrities who just made hundreds of millions of dollars, yet had yet seem to have even more than that in debt and were basically penniless or even in debt, when they passed on. So again, it's just the management of things that is so important. And I look at back to when I started work, being the middle of 2007, and I started work out as a residential real estate agent, just straight out of university, maybe a bit naive, certainly inexperienced. I was only 22, and I worked in the northern suburbs of Wellington, the capital of New Zealand, where I lived at the time and where I grew up. Um, and unfortunately, only 6 months into the job, we had the global financial crisis, the GFC, the credit crunch, the Great Recession, which basically hit us hard, especially here in New Zealand, and especially the property market. And it was just hell, And I was working on a pure commission job, and oh my god, how much I put into it and how little I got out, and then eventually I just had to sort of call it quits and move on. But if I look at it in hindsight, in some ways that was actually a real blessing in disguise because it made me struggle, and it taught me a lot and I became stronger. But again, it made me much better at managing money. Even though my income wasn't great, I was managing it very well, so I was still able to cover expenses, and save some money and move forward, if you like. And that has served me well to this day. And again, things that I say, like on that first talk video, 5 easy ways to save money, things I learned back then still serve me to this day. So looking back at it, it really was a blessing in disguise, and it was actually good to have learned that lesson earlier in life, say, as opposed to later in life, where say some older people who encountered the Great Recession, later in life, they might have actually wished, looking back, that they learned what they did from it earlier, like I did. So it just goes without saying, and it really can't be stressed enough. Just the management of things, cutting costs, managing in general. So whether it's financial or non-financial, just the general management of something and running it day to day is just extremely important no matter what it is, whether it's an individual, whether it's a company, whether it's a country, and whether you have a little or a lot to play with. And now, finally, coming to the topic of this talk video, after doing some studying of my own, I wonder if this was the example I'm about to give. Is this the greatest example of mismanagement ever? And from my own research and knowledge, I think it is. And this is the example of the Soviet Union. I know I've mentioned it before. I love history and I'm quite obsessed with 20th century history in particular. But the Soviet Union, if we look at the Soviet Union, 1945, if you like, April 1945, when basically the end of the war had finally ended and the Nazis, or horrible, awful Nazis, had been defeated. And what had happened, as you know, it started when Hitler's Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union or Russia, and they thought that they could take it on, and they were wrong because obviously Hitler was trying to take over as much as he could at the time. I do know that he had what he called Operation Sea Lion when he attacked the UK, Great Britain at the time, and that was 1940, and he failed in that. However, when he attacked France in the same year, 1940, he succeeded, and he actually managed to capture France in just 6 weeks. So I guess not so bad for what he was trying to achieve. And a bit like when he first started the war in September 1939, invading Poland, and the Polish forces gave up in just 3 weeks, and Poland was annexed by the Nazis. So by 1945, Hitler had captured most of Europe and some of northern Africa. And basically, I guess then he could look at, if he really wanted to, expand further, it could be either the UK or the Soviet Union, or it could be even just, maybe just sitting tight and building up forces for the time being. Just, I guess it's very arguable. But he went and attacked the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, and on top of that, he actually had an anti-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. They were not to fight each other. They were basically to just, be neutral with each other. And he had that anti-aggression pact and went, completely, went completely back on it. A bit like he had the anti-aggression pact also with the United States. But he had also declared war on the United States after, they were attacking Japan with Hiroshima. That was after Japan had, of course, invaded Pearl Harbor and done what they did there in December 1941, if I'm correct. But the Nazis, of course, attacked the Soviet Union, and that's how they failed, pretty much. And a lot of historians actually do argue that. Some historians believe that had Hitler not invaded the Soviet Union, maybe just kept back a bit and built up forces and maybe invaded it later or did something else, possibly his Nazi empire could have survived or at least survived longer. It is very arguable. Some people and some historians even argue that had he just invaded the Soviet Union in the summer, that could have made the difference because when they invaded at the time it was winter and they suffered a very, very bad winter, on the western part of the Soviet Union. So they invaded the Soviet Union and they failed. The Soviet Union defeated their forces, all of their forces, and they marched through Eastern Europe at the time. And everything the Nazis had, pretty much everything they had, was claimed by the Soviet Union. I know Germany itself was then divided into four parts, which went to, what was it? England, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and then eventually became East and West Germany, and then of course you had East and West Berlin, divided by the Berlin Wall, but that was constructed later in 1961, the so-called Iron Curtain. But coming back to sort of this topic, in 1945, at the end of the war, the Soviet Union was actually in a very, very good position. Unlike Europe, they weren't just in rubbles, defeated, having been through an awful, awful war. Of course, they had lost troops and they had suffered damage, but they were paid reparations for that damage. So, that obviously made it better. Not only that, they had captured Eastern Europe, and at the same time, they had a lot of not only Russia, but they had a lot of countries immediately to their south, such as the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, I think, and a lot of those sort of smaller countries around there. The Soviet Union was very, very large. Then, on top of that, they had China as a close ally, and there was even Cuba as well as an ally, which was perhaps on the other side of the planet, but still an ally nonetheless. So the Soviet Union at the end of World War II was in a pretty good position, relatively, especially compared to, like I said, the rest of Europe, which was basically in rubbles. America was also suffering. It had lost a lot after World War II, and of course after being defeated at Pearl Harbor. A lot of other countries that had participated in the war had also, suffered losses and, at the very least, large expenses. But the Soviet Union, they had all that territory, Russia, Eastern Europe, and those countries immediately south of Russia. They had a fair percentage of the world's land, area. And they were the a superpower. They were second in the world only to the United States at the time. They had a lot of wealth, at least in terms of resources and land, and they had a lot of people. They had their military, their army, they had a lot. I mean, if you look at it, they certainly had the potential to become the number one superpower on Earth had it been handled properly, and had things been handled and managed properly. And they didn't have to even import anything because they had all the resources they needed. They didn't have to even take over any other countries because they had so many countries already, which were part of their empire. But unfortunately, then came, well, unfortunately, he was already there for too long. Joseph Stalin. Oh my god, I mean, it's just, just unbelievably pathetic, paranoid as hell, and he let that drive everything. He didn't even care about his own son. He cared a lot about his own daughter, but he didn't even care about his own son. And he just really failed the Soviet people. It's just the things he did, like when he was trying to ramp up industrialization of the Soviet Union with all those 5-year plans and pushing it too hard, too fast, and taking people out of the agricultural areas, out of the country, out of the farms to work in those factories to push forward that industrialization. And then suddenly there's famine because there weren't enough people in the farms to produce food for everyone. He made mistakes like that. And yes, this endless purges of people that he believed were just out to get him because he was so damn paranoid, even people he worked with, and he just kept purging people, throwing them into forced labor camps, the gulags, or the gulags as they were known as, and they were very inhumane. How horribly he treated his own people, how much he mismanaged what he had, his empire, his country, his territory, and just, yeah, how poorly things were handled, and just all the potential that was wasted, which could have really been used very well if you think about it, to have had all that territory, all those resources, to be in the middle of it all, and to have all those people, and to be in a pretty good state relatively compared to, say, the rest of the world in 1945. But Stalin was there. He was there from 1924, and even how he got into it, he cheated. After Vladimir Lenin died, the natural successor was certainly Leon Trotsky, who was actually someone who really believed in socialism and who wanted to serve his country, just like Vladimir Lenin. But Stalin just wanted the job, and he cheated Trotsky by telling him the wrong date for Lenin's funeral, so Trotsky didn't show up, and then Stalin would point to that saying, oh, look, Trotsky doesn't care at all about Lenin, he didn't even come to the funeral, whereas Stalin not only went to the funeral, he was seen helping to carry Lenin's, casket when they were carrying him off and carrying him away. And it's amazing. His body is still there in the mausoleum in Russia, and they maintain it, and his body is still there. And this is since 1924, 100 years ago. But Stalin cheated his way into it, and he was there for 30 years, from 1924 to 1953, when he finally died. 30 years too long. He died in a puddle of his own urine, just sitting in his office for, I think it was more than 24 hours. People thought he was asleep, but he was just basically dying. And because, again, he feared doctors, he purged doctors. There were no doctors to serve him when he was sick, and he died. But coming back to it, it's when you really look at it, the Soviet Union was in a very, very good position at the end of World War II, being the second in the world, second only to the United States, being a superpower, having all that territory, all those resources, all those people, all that military, just everything it had. And it really could have, didn't even have to expand, but it really could have, grew itself and become very large. And perhaps even if it used socialism, it could have not been so violent, like, Stalin starting the Korean War, things like that. They could have just said, no, we're going to implement socialism, or at least our form of socialism. We're going to leave different countries in our empire to implement socialism according to their own unique cultures and ideals, and we're going to lead by example. We're not going to invade or attack any other countries. We don't need to. We're going to be a peaceful. I know it all sounds too good to be true, but I guess something like, or maybe even something similar to that or resembling that could have happened, especially with a much, much better leader or much better management. They could have, yeah, led by example, and they could have prospered and done very well. Other countries would have seen that and might have even joined them, or become close allies at least. But unfortunately, that wasn't to be. That all that potential was there. It really was at that time, with everything they had. But just one person, Joseph Stalin, was there, and he just completely ruined it all. Not only that, he killed, if I'm correct, about 24 million of his own people, and just the endless purges and throwing people into those gulags, the forced labor camps. And still, the economy didn't do so well, did it? They did industrialize. They had all those 5-year plans, but I think they always failed the targets. I think I remember reading in a book. I think only once did they exceed a target, but many other times they really failed. It didn't really work for them, and a lot of people were suffering and all that. And they weren't really prospering. They weren't really benefiting. They weren't really living as well as they could have. Um, and pretty much all because of Joseph Stalin. What a waste. And so, from what I saw, from what I read, that was probably, the single biggest case of mismanagement ever. And it's good to learn. It's always good to learn from history. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So, yeah, and hopefully more people learn from that, and hopefully it never happens again. Thank you.